So really appreciate the really nice event that Scott Pantel and the LSI team put together. When you think about this digital health medtech ecosystem and the fundraising ecosystem that he's built around it, it's fun to have a mix of some venture capitalists here with some startup founders and CEOs. So we'll have a fun group, and maybe I'll hand it off to Iwan to make some introductions.
Okay, thank you. My name is Iwan van Vijfeijken. I'm the CEO of Pulsify Medical. We're a Belgian medtech startup company founded in 2019. And we're developing a totally novel ultrasound wearable patch to continuously monitor the cardiac performance.
Great. Simon.
Hi, everyone. Simon Turner. I work with Sofinnova Partners. So we're one of the oldest life science venture capital companies.
So really focused in on early stage innovation in the life sciences space, biotechnology, medical devices and such. And of course, very interested in seeing how this digital space is also evolving.
Hi, Amos. Privileged to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Ken. I'm the founder and chief scientific officer of CardiaCare. It's a wearable device that actually treats patients by delivering non-invasive nerve stimulation, neuromodulation. We're targeting the vagus nerve, and we're doing that from the wrist. And we're targeting atrial fibrillation as our first indication by reducing atrial fibrillation burden, incidence, and symptoms for these patients. Early stage startup on the one hand, clinical stage on the other hand, and really happy to be here.
Great.
I'm Omid, Akhavan. I lead Anthro Ventures based out of DC, investing across the life sciences, but mainly in medtech, digital health, and healthcare services.
So when you think about this evolution of digital health and medtech, and now that they're kind of overlapping, you started out with different devices such as patches that may be single parameter patches. Now they're evolving to multi-parameter vital signs devices. There's multi-dimensional, multi-parameter implantables, wearables, now that connect into different software platforms. And it's created a whole new problem of too much data flowing into the practice, to the clinic. And so there's this question of how do you deal with that data? And so I'm interested, maybe this question will go to the venture guys first. When you're evaluating a digital health investment versus a pure medtech investment, what are the things you're looking for, and how do you evaluate that a little differently than a pure medtech investment?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, from our perspective, what we've seen is there's a fundamental change as well when you think about the digital health space versus, for example, medtech, in that on the one hand, medtech tends to be much more focused on developing a product, and that's it. It's a product component. When you're looking towards the digital health, these tend to be much more in line with a service model. So in fact, it kind of completely revolutionizes the approaches that, one, you have in terms of development of these services, and secondly, also the business models that you're able to develop with it. I guess these are one of the kind of core components that we see.
Yeah, and I think the key, as I look at digital health and various diagnostic signals, the real question comes down to what clinical utility exists from the biomarkers, the digital biomarkers that you're using, and what's the application, and how do you think about the even if you can figure out, okay, you have heart failure, well, what treatment can follow, and how does it fit within the context of healthcare delivery and actually resolving whatever the underlying disease is? And so what's the utility of those markers?
So as startup companies who are trying to raise capital, what are some of the challenges you all are facing when you're going to events like this and you're trying to raise money?
Right. Yeah, so I think you're right what you said earlier. As a startup company, you have to be focused, you have limited resources. Our differentiation, our unique IP is in the area of the device. Having said that, we are aware, of course, we need to fit into an overall system, and our data needs to somehow connect with existing infrastructure and indeed be prepared for emerging a multimodal wearable healthcare space. So we are thinking about that today in terms of the specification, not just of our device, but also what type of data, what kind of flexibility, the data that we offer, do we need to build in today, and also revenue models. We sell a device, But indeed, we are well aware that data and the value of data will also be a major contributor for the future. So indeed, I think that's also your point about services. Now, how that will pan out, that is really difficult, and we need partners for that.
Yeah, I think that the perspective of the VCs basically varies. One of the things I can't say there's one single thing that everybody gets, I want to say, latched on. I think that we, as an early stage startup, we progressed by understanding that they need to be able to V-check these boxes. It starts with IP, clinical data, mechanism of action. And lucky for us, as we finished our first human study, that's when things kind of started moving forward really fast. And I agree, market validation, market entry reimbursement is always a huge deal also. But on the other hand, I just had a discussion with a VC that said no to us, but when they heard that we're moving forward with some strategic deal, I said, okay, we want to reassess. They said no for a different reason in the past, but now, so it varies between the VCs and the outlook. Obviously, the team, the greatest thing maybe. If they don't connect to the team, then yeah, there's nothing going. But so not only does it vary between the VCs, we're seeing that it actually changes within the VC time depending on your maturity.
So one of the things we're seeing as a company at BIOTRONIK is there's this evolution of you have the silo of medtech, you have the silo of digital health. Now there's this overlapping of the two. And so for us, it's changing that mindset of a pure medical device company to also evolving into a digital health and diagnostics player. From an investment standpoint, how do you value the two? And do you place a higher valuation today on some of these evolving digital health technologies or on the pure medtech companies that are out there?
Should I take a first crack?
Sure, go for it.
So it's interesting, and again, it comes back to the kind of core fundamental differences, product and services, but also when you think about it, this whole new digital health space, it's kind of an amalgamation of several different components. You have life science pieces of that, regulatory, clinical evidence, need for reimbursement, et cetera, being built into it. But you also take learnings and lessons from the tech side of things. So rapid product iterations, this notion that actually the valuation of companies in most cases will be driven by commercialization, ARR, and maybe even get to profitability. This is something that we traditionally haven't seen in med tech and even in biotech, because normally you tend to de-risk along a relatively stable curve. You look at what is it in terms of a discounted cash flow for the actual indication, and then that's basically how you'll derive your valuation of the company. In the digital health space, what we're seeing is it's much more about the potential platform and the revenue generation that platform can entail. Is it a single standalone product, or does it have multiple service streams that can be developed from it? That all kind of gets baked into the way we're looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I look at the convergence of medtech and digital health, one of the big challenges, and having previously been at Becton Dickinson, we struggled with this as a company is, how do we use data to our advantage? How can we enhance our pull-through of products, into our customer base? And I don't think medtech companies have figured it out yet. It's not like Google and Apple and Facebook that can monetize data and have thousands of engineers working on products and iterating quickly. If you think about the informatics budget for most of these companies, it's it's insignificant. And so I think one of the big challenges as we look at this convergence is even if you can collect the data, how can you analyze it and use it, and then ultimately, how does that translate into revenue? And I don't think we've figured that out in med tech yet, because we understand how you sell a device, right? But even you look at the healthcare IT space, other than the EMR space, and because you had meaningful use and you had this big push to move from paper to digital. It's convincing a hospital to go spend money on a license, an annual license for software, like that's good luck, right? Especially as a startup. And so I think that's one of the challenges that I've seen in the digital health space is, how do you actually convince a strategic that there's revenue to be had from the data, and then it really comes down to reimbursement, right? And so I know we'll talk about that a little bit later in the panel.
So any other thoughts on that topic before we move on a little bit?
Well, yeah, I want indeed reimbursement. You both mentioned it, and this is indeed a challenge. Personally, I'm happy we're selling something that you can touch, right? It's a device.
Right.
In our case, it's a patch, and we know that there are money flows associated with selling a device. And as a small company, you have to follow the money, right? We cannot. In theory, we could try and generate new revenue streams, but really the best strategy is to follow the money as it is per today. And so it is indeed, I think, a great challenge if you talk about digital, is to get reimbursed for the digital part of the total offering.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing with that regard. Due to the fact that it's all new, even to the reimbursement folks at CMS, from what we're hearing from the KOLs, the true clinical value and health economics, if that can be shown over time, since this is making, there are moves by CMS for reimbursement. So focus, you can really show your the clinically valid and you're clinically significant and your health economics works, and reimbursement will come.
Maybe just one point on that.
Sure.
I just wanted to make it clear. I think we've seen it all, that reimbursement is not the only kind of driver of potential value, at least, because you have pharma, you have other med tech players, you have other services that are interested in this healthcare data. And we're seeing it more and more. So it's just interesting, again, to think about it, that reimbursement isn't the only goal you could have. There are multiple different sources.
Well, and to add to that, I think, the question is, do you think about, just basic vital signs monitoring, right, in pharma trials? I think, one of the, and I've looked at companies that have said, oh, like this is a segment of the market that we can go after. The question is, how big is it, right? And you look back 10 years ago in companion diagnostics, and pharma's going to spend all this money, and they'll go spend $50 million on trial. Well, how much are they really spending on the diagnostics piece? Like $2 million? So, like how big is your TAM and what's your SAM, and does the pharma company see utility in it? And so I think that's one of the challenges as well, is, are you really adding to that study in a meaningful way that's going to help accelerate approval or get the FDA comfortable? And I think that's something that as a startup you have to really think about. It's easy to do broad brushstrokes, generalities. Oh, there's money in this bucket and that bucket. But when you get to the brass tacks of who's going to pay for it and why, well, for a hospital, it's going to come out of their P&L, right? Unless, or it's going to eat up a part of their DRG. And, for a pharma company, it's just adding to their expense of the clinical trial. And so it's got to be meaningful for them to actually want to spend the money.
So it's interesting when you think how far wearables have come. 10 years ago, when I left Guidant in Boston Scientific, cardiac rhythm management world, I'd been in it for maybe 10 years, to go to iRhythm and take that risk in a startup. I had many people ask me, why are you giving up your medical device career, and why would you do that? And then you look at how far the wearables world has come from a diagnostics area to now there's wearable therapeutics. And would love to both get your take on this, Amos, as developing a wearable therapeutic technology. How, as investors, are you guys looking at digital and wearable therapeutics today as versus what you might have thought of them 5-10 years ago?
I think that the challenge of being, or of foresight, or looking quite ahead in the distance, has to do with the fact that you're actually proposing value that the market may not be ready for. That's what happened to us initially when we started. We always had the vision that wearables will switch from consumer grade to medical grade, initially as sensors. The Apple ECG came as no surprise to us. And it's always been our vision that you collect all this data, but you need to manifest some therapy to it. And if you can show therapy. So we always believe that the natural evolution of wearables is going towards wearable therapeutics, and that's what we're doing. And wearable therapeutics are not new. You know, you have insulin pumps there. There's cardiac pacemakers. The notion of treating patients at home has been out there, but the novelty of doing it non-invasively, at low risk, and especially now the post-pandemic, when everybody's seen the need for home care, not just monitoring, but also therapy. So it's always been our vision. That said, it's challenging when you talk to VCs because almost the world is not just yet ready for that. But it's the risk that we do as entrepreneurs.
I feel like in cardiology, they're a little bit cowboys, and so they were doing remote patient monitoring before the pandemic, and it was a 10, 15-year-old space. And so now, post-COVID, there's so many other wearables, there's so many other wearable therapeutics now that are evolving, but because of COVID, it's taken away that question mark of will an older patient use this technology. Now we know that if they need to, they can do it, they can figure it out, and it is a model that's worth pursuing. So as investors, how do you see that space continuing to evolve? I think earlier today, people said that we've retracted a bit. Maybe we have a little, but I still feel like we're really moving forward, and that whole world has changed now that we're in this post-COVID environment. But as investors, how are you seeing things today versus maybe a year ago when we were in the middle of the chaos of COVID? Is it the same or has it changed?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say, and I'd go back probably 5 years.
Yeah.
And as you think about the value, so I would say COVID put us into a sprint in terms of telemedicine and remote patient monitoring. And I would say kind of in the mid to late 2000s, you had all these companies came out trying to do remote patient monitoring. Many of them failed, raised a lot, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of venture capital. And I think the challenge there was, how are you getting paid? What's the business model? You have a services business model. Okay, you're really, an operating business. It's not a, tech-enabled service where you have, 90%, 80% gross margins. You have people that have to monitor those patients. And so it's not like the medical device field where you're making 70, 80, 90% gross margins and you have feet on the street selling and then you get ramp and profitability. But really for every dollar of revenue you're collecting, you're spending 50, 60 cents on manpower, right, to manage those patients, and that's not being passed off to the clinics. And so I think with COVID now, and this decentralization of care and this push to move to the patient-centered medical home, which, I was talking about in like 2008, like the UNC Health System was doing, and North Carolina in general is doing a big push to the patient-centered medical home. I think now you've gotten better sensors, better technology, better understanding. I think the question becomes, how do you get paid? And are insurance companies willing to pay you the same way that they pay you for an in-office visit? And you're seeing that shift, and I think payers are starting to realize, actually, maybe there's something here, but that requires a policy shift, and it requires, both payers and providers and integrated delivery networks to really focus on, okay, what's in the best interest of our patients, and how do we incentivize startups and big med tech companies to innovate to deliver better care for our patients. And I think it's happening, right? And COVID, I think, jump-started that. I think the next 5 years, we're going to see how it all plays out.
I think with the evolution of the RPM codes, so remote physiologic parameter codes for vital signs, the remote therapeutic monitoring codes, RTM codes, we're headed in the right direction. Not that that's necessarily enough to reimburse for some of these solutions, but I think we're starting to head in the right direction. You go back 10 years ago and we had to get new code. So at iRhythm, we had to get a totally new code, which was not a fun process. But you fast forward and you look at the valuations of some of these companies, and it did work out. Right. It's just a more expensive and longer road. but with the RPM codes, with the RTM codes, at least there's a pathway, and hopefully CMS will continue to come out with codes like that. So as startup companies on the diagnostic front and in the therapeutic front, how are you guys viewing the way the reimbursement is going?
No, I think we all see this broad trend towards telemedicine, home monitoring, wearables, replacing more and more invasive solutions. But indeed, as you indicate, it's a slow moving. It's a broad trend, but it's very slow moving. I think I can say, luckily at Pulsify, we're in a situation where our roadmap calls for our first product in the hospital, in the ICU, in fact, and then the hospital ward, and after that we go to home monitoring. Also because we have quite a novel concept, so we really need to start at the beginning. So in a way, I think that makes it a little bit easier, and I hope by the time we have a home monitoring device that all the money streams are there, because I rather follow it than lead it.
Right.
So your example, I would hate to have to go that route, because it takes a lot of time and money, right?
So any thoughts on the therapeutic front, Amos?
Yeah. As I said before, first of all, we're not alone in the therapeutic or the external non-invasive therapeutic realm. So there's companies out there that do have actually products on the market, and some of them are big companies that are fighting some of the battle for us. Some successfully, some not. But I think our view, since the CardiaCare device has both monitoring aspects and therapeutic aspects. In fact, the therapy, again, if you ask me what the next evolution of the therapy would be, it will be optimizing therapeutic care by monitoring. So combining this is what we're working on in terms of AI today, on optimizing stimulation. Anyway, so we're tackling both of these aspects. We're looking at the RTMs and the RPM codes and the existing codes, and we're trying to build business models and projections starting from the lowest, and again, you're reducing the COGS and making sure that we're profitable even with low reimbursement. But so we're looking at both aspects: external nerve stimulation devices, and then also the remote patient monitoring codes, and they are expanding. I think is it $320 for algorithm already for a test? So
Something like that.
yeah. Yeah.
So when you think about this continuum of care from the consumer, the worried well consumer, to the symptomatic patient, and different devices that are used to monitor whatever vital signs, and then the diagnosed patient, the treated patient, and then the post-therapy monitoring of those same patients, if you're tracking that data across that whole care continuum, you start to see patterns, and then you can eventually start to develop predictive analytics and then risk management tools and chronic care management tools. What's the most exciting part of that care continuum as an investor? Is it the whole continuum, data across the whole continuum, or are you most excited about the treatment side, the diagnostic side?
Yeah.
Where do you guys stand today?
It's interesting because I think over the last 5-10 years, what we saw were kind of individual bricks being built and developed, and they were already a massive leap forwards. But when we start thinking about it, ultimately what we're looking to, and Omid, you said this, it's outcomes. It's that impact on patients, on care. So today what we're seeing is a general shift towards actually it's a full-bore solution that you're looking for. From the moment patients start coming into the healthcare system, how are you able to integrate them into your, if it's a platform, or at least your care pathway management. So that way you capture the patient, you manage that patient throughout the journey. Ultimately, you can even build potentially more value streams into that by integrating third-party providers, if it's a digital therapeutic, or if it's some sort of a monitoring system. This is really where I see a lot of innovation, a lot of promise going forwards. But ultimately, it's kind of the platform owners, not necessarily the individual brick or feature developers per se.
Yeah, so it's interesting because when I look at where we are and where we're headed, so I think the opportunity is around personalized healthcare, right? Because everybody has different set of biomarkers, and you can think about it in two ways. One, you have your genetic markers, right, which there's been a lot of work in genomics research, but then you also have, the digital biomarkers, right, and you think about lifestyle change, and so much of, curing disease comes down to change in lifestyle, and I think the trend is going to be towards taking that data, trying to interpret it, trying to come up with algorithms or solutions or care interventions along the pathway that can actually improve outcomes. The challenge I think we have in the U.S. healthcare system is, Europe is a little bit better, but we don't really pay for prevention, right? And so really it's, you get paid for intervention. It's still a fee, I look at Obamacare and the whole drive was, to value-based medicine and how do you get paid to provide better outcomes and better care. The reality is we've never shifted away from the fee-for-service model, right? Now you look at the IDNs are moving in that direction, the at-risk providers, and there's a whole wave and movement to try and improve profitability in healthcare for providers that deliver better care. But the reality is the majority of the system is all about, do a procedure, get paid. And so I think the risk and the challenge as an investor looking at the digital health space is, how can you encompass and then get paid for actually this whole continuum of care and managing, and looking at the patient and coming up with predictive signals. And for whatever reason, we talked about this yesterday, we don't value diagnostics in the healthcare system, right? And you look at the value that pharma takes in treating a patient, $20,000, $50,000 for a drug or even in a procedure, right? $20,000, $50,000, $100,000 for a surgery. You're getting, and this was the struggle in like molecular-based diagnostics where they're trying to charge $3,000 so that they can make a business, and the DOJ came after them, and everything's being pushed down to like $10 to $50, per diagnostic, which doesn't become sustainable for companies. And so I think that's the struggle that we, and the dichotomy in the US healthcare system is how do you ultimately navigate that? And I think the Europeans have done a better job, right? Because there's more focus on primary care. And so there's a push towards, oh, Siri, always listening. European healthcare system, I think, are more conscious of that, and how do you actually keep the patient at home and keep them healthy and engage in preventive medicine. So I think that's going to be an interesting shift in the U.S. healthcare system is how do you pay for prevention?
So it's interesting. At the beginning of 2021, there was a 45-day period where 3 of the 4 biggest players in cardiac monitoring got acquired. Basically, it got announced that they were going to get acquired. And I'd spent 10 years trying to get the big device companies to acquire one of these companies. To your point, they didn't value diagnostics. Now all of a sudden you see value in diagnostics. You start to see these acquisitions, and that's a perfect example. 3 of the 4 biggest players in 45 days getting acquired. What is that next area that you all see to have a run on some of these startup companies? Is it vital signs monitoring companies? Is it wearable therapeutics? Do you guys have a pulse for that, or do you have an opinion on that? I'd love to hear both the investors and the startup guys what your take is.
So I'm not necessarily sure it's going to be in any one particular indication, more in terms of what is the field trying to achieve. And one of those is probably going to be much more about personalized medicine. So this notion that we need to understand patients better to be able to identify, 1, when are they going to get sick? 2, when should we intervene? And 3, also, what is the intervention we should use and in what dosage, if it's a therapy or if it's the medical device that's bespoke to it. And the entire idea is cutting out the inefficiencies that we see, because we're being very reactive today. What we're going to head towards, hopefully in the future, is going to be something much more proactive. So we're able to predict, therefore take an action and basically an intervention before the patient really gets ill and crashes into care rather. So I see that being a huge piece, and I guess as a kind of other secondary area, mental health has been growing substantially in terms of uses. I would again, though, think it'd be much more about how can you get a full-bore solution in terms of identifying patients early and then providing them preventive care as they move through, rather than, you know, here is a DTX bespoke for major depressive disorders, for example.
Yeah, so it's really exciting to hear that from you guys. I'm sitting between two tier 1 VCs and they're talking about exactly what we're doing. So I don't know, but so you're saying personalized approach. I think AFib is a great example. Atrial fibrillation has lifestyle triggers. It can be stress, it can be meal, it can be post-exercise, it can be organic problems in the heart. One of the things that we are aiming to do is to identify these personal triggers and actually to actually treat these patients and prevent an upcoming event with that. And so we're betting on that. So we're betting on personalization. Much more difficult task from a clinical perspective and subgroup analysis when you do that, for sure. But we're still betting on that as a big thing, and also prevention. What we're doing right now is we're working on algorithms that predict an upcoming AF event, and then treat in order to prevent an upcoming event, and in that regard, actually prevent the progression of AFib, which is a progressive disorder. So that's kind of our bet.
If I may, because I'm actually a physicist by training, and so entering into the medical world, it never ceases to surprise me how poor the data is that doctors have available to make very important decisions together with the patients, right? The paucity of data is staggering, and they need to make decisions. And I think this is where wearable technology can really make a difference by providing much more longitudinal data that you can link to outcomes. Because in your speak, yes, we are a brick, right? And of course, it's all about ultimately the outcomes in the whole continuum care pathway. But also within our pillar, so to speak, our brick, we can also really demonstrate that outcomes are changing for the better. So it's not just, I think, the continuum, it's also providing that evidence of improved outcomes just by having much better information. And of course, you need to demonstrate that better information leads to better clinical outcomes, no doubt, and cost savings, etc., blah, blah, blah. So I think it's both ways.
Yeah.
So you hear people say that there's a softening of investments in digital health, and I disagree with that. So you see that 2021 was a huge outlier, obviously much bigger than any other year, but if you compare 2022 and the trajectory that we're on, it's still much higher than 2019 or 2020. So we're heading in the right direction. I think 2021 was just an outlier. But to say that it was a huge bubble and it's softening, yeah, it's not as high as 2021, but it's still much greater than prior years. When you think about where you all are putting your money, and maybe you can't talk to this, I don't know, but how much of the excitement is around digital health today versus medtech, pure medtech?
I mean, I'd say from our perspective, it's extremely interesting. We look at this field and we think, wow, this is set to grow in many ways, shapes, and forms. I mean, part of it is also because when you start looking even at biotechnology, medical devices, pharma services, etc., you're seeing more and more digital health integration into it, as a fundamental component of it. May not be the only asset driver in a company, but it's there, it's present, it's gaining traction and momentum. So I think it's only set to grow. The big shift, I guess, we've seen a lot, and this comes down to also kind of valuations of companies and also the speed at which deals are being executed. It's that it seems to become a bit more professionalized in terms of understanding these digital health companies, because they incorporate both tech and life science needs. Before, you could probably get away with doing these well-being companies, which drove up valuations, which created kind of a frenzied cycle. That seems to have slowed down a lot more now because some people have gotten burned, but there's also a lot more understanding that you need to get commercialization models. You also need to get the fundamental needs for a life science company, which is quite different.
Yeah, I think I would agree, and I would say probably a lot of the dollars. So if you think about the business that Fitbit built, right? Starting with just counting your steps, right? Something so simple as that, and building a lifestyle around, like get your 10,000 steps. And then you look at Apple and Garmin entering into the market. I think it takes, and we didn't talk about this on the panel, but thinking about like consumerization of healthcare and really consumer-driven demand. I think over time, this desire for personalized medicine and personalized interaction with digital health apps and care management using tracking of these digital biomarkers will become the standard of care. Yep. The question is, from a dollars perspective, where do you as an investor take the risk? Is it in building another wearable, right? Is it in validating the algorithm, right? And the clinical signal that can then be put onto the Apple Watch or the Fitbit or something else? So I think that's a question that's still to be answered. Is like, does the world need another thing on your wrist, right? And that's a question, right? Yeah. But also, how willing are these incumbents like Fitbit and Apple willing to integrate and make it worth their while? Because as I think about the commercial channel, right, trying to go and spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to reach a consumer base and educate them on what you have, it's an impossible task that I don't think any healthcare VC will take that risk. Maybe on the tech side they will. But as you think about in the clinical setting, right, it's a smaller market in terms of like locations and stakeholders. But then it's really you have to prove the clinical value, right? And I think you have to work within the reimbursement scheme to make sure that you can actually fund your company and grow. And then ultimately strategics, and we talked about this, all the acquisitions they did, I don't know if they necessarily, I mean, it's a profitable business, but I think a lot of them looked at it as a defensive play and a way to stay relevant and to actually capture more data on their end customer, which is the patient.
And I think as you see this evolution continuing to happen, BIOTRONIK just announced a partnership a few weeks ago with AliveCore and with Pacemate, because now you have all this data from all these implantables, these wearables, these consumer-grade technologies, and now you want it to all be connected and flowing into one common platform that's bidirectionally integrated THR. And so I think that's the next phase of where we're going with digital health. So I know we're out of time. Appreciate you guys all doing this panel. A lot of fun. We could talk for hours. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks all.